Most people quit reversing insulin resistance in exactly the same window, the point where they feel completely different, but their blood test still says nothing has changed. That gap is not a sign the plan is failing. It's simply how your body's measurements work, and understanding that gap might be the single most useful thing in this video. Today we're walking through what actually happens inside your body, phase by phase, as insulin resistance reverses from the first days all the way to months later. 3 stages, each with its own timeline and its own set of markers, so by the end you'll know exactly what to expect and roughly when to expect it. Quick disclaimer before we start. This video describes widely documented physiological patterns. It isn't personal medical advice, and any changes to medication or treatment should happen with a qualified clinician. With that said, this is one of the most requested breakdowns I get, because almost every resource out there talks about how to start reversing insulin resistance, but almost nothing explains what the recovery actually looks like once you're already in it. Here's the core idea driving this entire video. Your blood tests have a built-in delay, and almost nobody explains that delay before people give up too early. HbA1c, the standard long-term blood sugar marker, reflects glucose bound to your red blood cells, and those cells live in your bloodstream for roughly 120 days. That means an HbA1c reading is really an average of your last 3 months, weighted most heavily toward whatever happened in the most recent few weeks. Fasting insulin and fasting glucose work completely differently. They're immediate, single point-in-time snapshots, while a calculated measure called HOMA-IR sits somewhere in between the two. This is exactly why people start feeling different weeks before any lab number actually moves. The symptoms respond fast, but the tests are built to move slowly on purpose. Most people who abandon a metabolic improvement plan do it in precisely this gap, the stretch where the body has already responded but the paperwork hasn't caught up yet. Understanding that the lag is a feature of how the measurement works, not a failure of your effort, is the difference between quitting in month 2 and seeing real results by month 6. So let's start where the body starts, in the first days and weeks, because this is where change happens fastest and where it's easiest to miss if you don't know what to look for. This stage is almost entirely symptom-driven, which means you'll feel every single one of these shifts happening in real time, often before you've even lost a noticeable amount of weight. In stage 1, days to weeks in, the first thing to fade is the energy crash that used to hit after meals, driven by a lower post-meal insulin spike and less reactive hypoglycemia. If you used to hit a wall an hour or 2 after eating, needing a nap or a second coffee just to function, that specific crash is usually one of the very first things to disappear, sometimes within the first week alone. Right alongside that, cravings for refined carbohydrates start losing their grip because a more stable blood sugar level flattens the dopamine-driven pull that used to make those cravings feel urgent. For a lot of people, this is the change that finally makes the whole process feel sustainable. When the craving itself fades, willpower stops being the thing carrying you through the day. You'll likely notice a fast drop on the scale too, often 2 to 4 kilograms in the first 2 weeks alone, and that's mostly water weight, not fat. Lower insulin means your kidneys retain less sodium, and water always follows sodium, so as insulin drops, so does the fluid your body had been holding onto. This is exactly why the first 2 weeks on a serious metabolic reset often show the fastest number on the scale you'll ever see during the entire process. And it's also exactly why that speed levels off so abruptly afterward, because it was never fat loss to begin with. Knowing that distinction upfront matters because a lot of people mistake that early water weight drop for a permanent rate of progress, get discouraged when week 3 looks slower, and quit right as the real fat loss phase is only just beginning. Bloating tends to ease around this same window, tied to both that reduced water retention and to less carbohydrate-driven fermentation happening in your gut. Here's a number that actually can move fast: your triglyceride to HDL ratio, a simple marker that can show real improvement within 4 to 6 weeks on a standard lipid panel. A ratio above roughly 3 has been linked to insulin-resistant states across multiple studies, and it's one of the earliest numbers on a lab report worth watching closely. By weeks to months in, stage 2, the changes move from how you feel to how your body is actually reshaping itself, starting with where your fat is stored. Visceral fat, the metabolically active fat wrapped around your organs, gets mobilized faster than subcutaneous fat sitting just under your skin, especially in people carrying a lot of central weight. That's because visceral fat cells are more hormonally active and more responsive to a calorie deficit than the fat sitting just under your skin, so your body tends to pull from that deep abdominal store first, before it starts drawing down fat elsewhere. Practically, that means the waistline is usually the very first place noticeable change shows up, even in people whose total scale weight hasn't dropped dramatically yet. That shows up on a DEXA scan, an MRI, or a simple waist measurement somewhere around 8 to 16 weeks in, though you'll likely notice it in how your clothes fit even earlier than that. One of the more visible stage 2 changes is in your skin itself, specifically a condition called acanthosis nigricans, the dark, velvety patches that show up at the neck, armpits, and groin. That discoloration is a direct visible marker of high insulin levels, and it typically starts fading around 3 to 6 months in, with full reversal often lining up with substantial weight loss. It's one of the few insulin resistance markers you can actually see with your own eyes in the mirror, rather than waiting on a lab report, which makes it a genuinely useful, if slower, progress indicator for a lot of people tracking their own recovery. Because it's driven by the same hyperinsulinemia responsible for the deeper metabolic changes, watching that patch of skin gradually lighten is, in a real sense, watching your insulin levels come down in real time. Small skin tags, medically called acrocordons, tend to reduce around this same period too, since they're linked to the same hyperinsulinemia and insulin-like growth factor signaling driving the skin changes. Blood pressure often starts trending down in this window as well, because high insulin drives both sodium retention and extra activity in your sympathetic nervous system, and both ease as insulin resistance improves. Some studies on weight loss programs have documented systolic blood pressure drops of 5 to 15 points, enough in many cases that people no longer need blood pressure medication, always under a doctor's guidance. That connection surprises a lot of people because blood pressure gets treated as a completely separate condition in most conversations, when in reality, for a huge number of people, it's downstream of the exact same insulin problem driving everything else on this list. Bringing insulin down doesn't just help your blood sugar numbers, it can directly ease the sodium retention and nervous system overactivity that's been keeping your blood pressure elevated the whole time. Sleep tends to improve here too, particularly for anyone dealing with sleep apnea, since reduced visceral fat and better airway dynamics both play a role in fewer nighttime breathing interruptions. Full apnea severity improvements, measured by something called the AHI score, typically show up on a sleep study around 6 to 12 months into a serious weight loss effort. And here's a stage 2 number worth watching closely. Fasting insulin often drops 30 to 50% by 4 to 8 weeks in, well before fasting glucose itself has moved at all. That happens because your pancreas simply doesn't need to pump out as much insulin once your cells start responding to it properly again, so output falls before blood sugar levels catch up. There's a mechanism worth understanding here. Your muscles pull in glucose using a transporter called GLUT4, and normally insulin is what pushes GLUT4 to the surface of muscle cells to let glucose in. Exercise triggers that same GLUT4 movement through a completely separate pathway, involving something called AMPK, which means physical activity can pull glucose into your muscles even when insulin signaling itself is still impaired. That's one of the most practical levers available in the early months, because it works independently of how resistant your cells currently are to insulin itself. In plain terms, that means a walk after a meal can lower your blood sugar response even on a day when your insulin resistance is still fully present, because your muscles have a separate doorway for glucose that doesn't need insulin's permission to open. This is part of why movement, even something as simple as consistent daily walking, shows up so often in recovery timelines. It's not just calorie burning, it's a direct, insulin-independent way to pull sugar out of your bloodstream. Now we move into stage 3, months onward, where the deepest and slowest changes finally start showing up, beginning with your liver. Hepatic steatosis, fat stored in the liver, is one of the very first places your body deposits excess fat when insulin resistance sets in, but it's also sensitive to caloric deficit and cutting back on fructose and refined carbs. MRI studies have documented measurable liver fat reduction at just 12 weeks into a dietary intervention, with the biggest reductions showing up in people who've lost somewhere around 5 to 10% of their body weight. The liver is usually one of the first organs to store excess fat when insulin resistance develops, which also makes it one of the more responsive organs once caloric intake and refined carbohydrate intake both come down. This is also, finally, where HbA1c starts to move, roughly 2 to 3 months behind everything else, simply because it's reflecting the cumulative effect of red blood cells cycling out over that entire period. Triglycerides typically settle at a meaningfully lower baseline by this point too, often a 20 to 40% reduction somewhere around the 3 to 6 month mark. For anyone dealing with PCOS, hormone patterns often start normalizing in this same window, since high insulin drives excess ovarian androgen production, and lowering insulin usually improves ovulatory frequency within 3 to 6 months. For a lot of women with PCOS, That's a meaningful piece of information because the insulin connection means the same recovery timeline driving weight and skin changes is also quietly working on psychoregularity in the background. There's even evidence of partial beta cell recovery over months to years as the glucose and lipid burden on those cells eases, though this recovery appears more likely to stick if the weight loss itself is sustained long term. Let's talk about the actual numbers doctors use to track all of this, starting with HOMA-IR, the homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance. The formula is fasting insulin in micro-international units per milliliter, multiplied by fasting glucose in milligrams per deciliter, divided by 405, and a typical normal range is cited as below 1 to 2, with lower generally being better. Fasting insulin itself is measured directly, and normal upper bound citations typically run 5 to 10 micro-international units per milliliter, meaning a drop from 20 down to 8 in the early months of a program is entirely possible while HbA1c still technically reads pre-diabetic. HbA1c remains useful, but it's a lagging indicator by design, and the American Diabetes Association defines diabetes remission as HbA1c below 6.5%, sustained for at least 3 months, without any glucose-lowering medication. That word choice matters, remission, not cure, because the underlying metabolic predisposition doesn't disappear, it simply stays inactive as long as the lifestyle changes that produce the improvement are sustained. That distinction isn't just semantic, it changes how you should think about the entire process. This isn't a finish line you cross once and forget about. It's an ongoing state you maintain, the same way managing any other chronic tendency requires ongoing attention. So why does the way you feel lead the actual lab numbers by so much? And it comes down to 2 specific reasons worth remembering. First, your sympathetic nervous system, your energy stability, and your inflammation levels all start improving within days to weeks, long before any of the deeper structural markers have had time to settle. These are the changes your body actually experiences moment to moment, so it makes sense they'd be the first ones you notice, well before anything shows up on paper. Second, the integrated tests doctors rely on for diagnosis, especially HbA1c, are deliberately designed for diagnostic stability, built to ignore short-term noise rather than to track rapid week-to-week change. That design choice is actually the correct one for diagnosing disease in the first place, but it makes HbA1c a genuinely poor tool for someone trying to judge whether their current program is actually working. In the first 90 days specifically, fasting insulin, fasting glucose, post-meal glucose logs, blood pressure trends, scale weight, and waist circumference are all far better day-to-day progress markers than HbA1c will ever be in that window. So if you're in week 6 feeling noticeably better, and your last blood test still says nothing has changed, that's not a contradiction. That's exactly how these 2 different systems are supposed to behave. Hold on to that the next time a lab result feels discouraging. The number on that page is describing your last 90 days, not the progress you made this week. The visible changes, the fading skin discoloration, the dropping blood pressure, the deeper sleep, those are your body's real-time signal, arriving months before the paperwork agrees with what you already know. If you want to understand exactly which markers to track week by week so you're never guessing whether a program is actually working, I've built out that complete tracking breakdown in the video linked right here.